Hello and welcome to Basics for Gamers presents The Basics of Damage Part 2 for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In Part 1 we discussed the 4-step process for determining damage, and in this video we're going to expand on that by covering a few of the less familiar damage types, starting with alignment damage. Alignment damage is a special kind of damage often associated with divine spellcasters and fiends. There are 4 types of alignment damage: chaotic, evil, good, and lawful. When a damaging effect applies alignment damage, only creatures of the opposite alignment can be harmed. So for example, the cleric of a good aligned deity attacks an enemy with divine lance. In the description for the spell, we see it deals alignment damage based on the caster's chosen deity. In this case, the spell inflicts good alignment damage, which means it will only harm a creature that has one of the 3 evil alignments. If the cleric hits a devil with divine lance, it will harm it because devils are evil. But if the same cleric shoots a divine lance at a vicious cloaker, it won't have any effect at all, because cloakers are chaotic neutral and only evil creatures can be harmed by good alignment damage. However, lawful alignment damage would harm a cloaker. It is important to note that alignment damage comes from an effect and has nothing to do with a character's alignment. Take for example a good aligned cleric who hits a monster that has the weakness good 5 with their hammer. This attack will not trigger the monster's weakness because hammers deal blunt damage. It doesn't matter what alignment the person wielding the hammer is. The fact that their alignment is good does not trigger the monster's weakness to good. But if that cleric was wielding a holy warhammer that deals an extra 1d6 good damage, then that would trigger the monster's weakness and apply an extra 5 points of damage. Positive and negative are 2 special types of energy damage. These names can be confusing to new players, but they're actually pretty simple. Positive damage only harms the undead and has no effect at all on living creatures or objects. Other game systems might call this holy or radiant energy. And negative damage is just the opposite of that. Negative damage only harms living creatures and has no effect at all on the undead or on objects. Other games you have played might have called this unholy or necrotic damage. And some effects like heal and harm spells can also rejuvenate some creatures while at the same time harming others. For example, a heal spell can release a burst of positive energy that will heal any living creatures in the area while at the same time harming any undead in that area. That's how it works when dealing with positive energy or negative energy, but when the effect specifically says the word damage, like with positive damage, then it has no healing effects at all and can only be used to harm undead. Another damage type worth discussing is precision damage. Precision damage is additional damage offered by some special abilities and effects that increase the damage of a regular attack. The key to remember here is that with precision damage, it increases the base damage type. For example, the rogue sneak attack deals precision damage. If a first level rogue performs a sneak attack with a dagger, it will deal 1d4 piercing damage for the dagger and 1d6 precision damage for the sneak attack. But these are not 2 different pools of damage. You wouldn't apply 1d4 piercing for the dagger and then 1d6 precision damage for the sneak attack. Instead, the precision damage increases the base damage, meaning this rogue would deal 1d4 plus 1d6 piercing damage when they score a sneak attack with a dagger. The distinction of increasing the base damage instead of applying it as 2 separate pools of damage is important when dealing with resistances and weaknesses. For example, say this rogue used their sneak attack against a skeleton with resistance 5 versus piercing damage. If you treated the piercing and precision damage separately, and the rogue rolled a 2 for the dagger's piercing damage and a 6 for the sneak attack's precision damage, You might be tempted to say that the skeleton's resistance to piercing of 5 would nullify the dagger's damage, but the skeleton would still suffer the 6 precision damage from the sneak attack, and that's not correct. Instead, precision damage raises the base damage type of the attack that is associated with, so in this case, it would be 1d4 plus 1d6 piercing damage, 2 on one die and 6 on the other would be 8 piercing damage, which is then lowered by 5 due to the skeleton's resistance to piercing, leaving only 3 points of damage. Another kind of damage worth discussing because it functions a little differently is persistent damage. Persistent damage is a condition that causes damage to reoccur more than once. Things like bleed damage, acid, or being set on fire could all be examples of persistent damage. When you are under the effect of persistent damage, you will suffer the listed amount of damage at the end of each of your turns, after which you roll a DC 15 flat check, and if successful, you remove the persistent damage condition. For example, if you're hit with an attack that applies 5 points of persistent fire damage, then at the end of your next turn, you will suffer 5 points of fire damage and roll 1d20. Since this is a flat check, there are no bonuses or penalties applied to this roll, it's just a straight 1d20. If the die shows a 15 or higher, then the persistent damage condition goes away, and if the die shows a 14 or lower, then it continues, and at the end of your next turn, you will suffer another 5 points of fire damage and roll another DC 15 flat check. The good news is you're not at the mercy of one flat check every round to remove the condition. You can also use assisted recovery. Assisted recovery can be taken by yourself or by an ally and costs 2 actions. When you take the assisted recovery action, you explain to the GM what you would like to do to stop the persistent damage, and they determine what effect your actions will have. The normal result of assisted recovery is the afflicted character immediately makes an extra DC 15 flat check to end the persistent damage, but the GM may grant additional bonuses depending on your specific circumstances. Say you're on fire and suffering persistent fire damage. If you spend 2 actions on assisted recovery and explain to the GM that you're patting yourself down with leather gloves to smother the fire, they may grant you an immediate DC 15 flat check. If you say you open your water skin and you pour it on you, they may lower the DC of that check to 10. And if you spend 2 of your actions to jump into a river, then they may rule that the fire automatically goes out without the need for any additional flat check. The GM is also free to make any other judgment calls that they think are appropriate, such as increasing or decreasing the number of actions needed, or automatically ending bleed damage once you're healed to full. Also, immunities, resistances, and weaknesses all apply to persistent damage and are considered separate from an effect's initial damage. So for example, if you have a flaming warhammer that deals 1d8 bludgeoning damage plus 1d4 points of persistent fire damage, and the target has vulnerability 5 to both bludgeoning and fire, they will suffer 1d8 plus 5 bludgeoning damage on the hit, and another 1d4 plus 5 fire damage at the end of their next turn, as well as at the end of every other turn until the persistent condition ends. That said, the GM may rule that the persistent damage doesn't apply in some situations. For example, if attacking with a sword that deals slashing and persistent bleed damage, if the target has resistance to slashing and no actual damage is applied by the sword attack, then the GM may rule that the additional persistent bleed damage doesn't occur at all. As always, the GMs are empowered to make whatever judgment calls they believe are appropriate for each given situation. And last, it's good to remember that double damage caused by a critical hit does double the damage of any persistent damage also caused by that effect. So if an alchemist throws an acid flask that deals 1d6 persistent acid damage and scores a critical hit on that attack, the unfortunate target of that attack is going to suffer 2d6 acid damage at the end of each and every one of their turns until the persistent condition goes away. In this video, we discussed a few of the less common features of the damage system. Alignment damage is a type of damage that only harms creatures with the opposite alignment of the damage. Good damage only harms evil creatures, chaotic damage only harms lawful creatures, and so on. Positive and negative damage are types of energy damage. Positive damage harms the undead and has no effect at all on living creatures or objects, and negative damage harms the living but has no effect on undead creatures or objects. Precision damage increases the base damage of an attack, emphasis on increases. A dagger that deals extra precision damage represents all of that damage as piercing, it's just more piercing. And persistent damage is damage that reoccurs at the end of each of the victim's turns, after which they roll a DC 15 flat check to make it go away. They or an ally can spend 2 actions to perform assisted recovery to grant more of these checks before suffering the damage at the end of their turn. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our patrons. These videos would not be possible without their continued generosity and support. Members of the Basics for Gamers Patreon community receive special benefits, like getting to vote on the topics that we cover in the future, and also they get to see these videos 1 week and ad-free before everybody else. Visit the link shown on the left of the screen and in the description if you'd like to know more about becoming a patron. If you would like to support this channel and help it grow, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you get notified when new videos release. And we can always be reached through our Twitter and Facebook pages too. Thanks for watching, take care, and we will see you soon with more Basics of Pathfinder.